it's lovely to see you both. So what we're talking about today, how to get people to talk to you. How do journalists get their stories and get the people they want to tell them these stories to trust them? And when I was thinking about this, it really is one of the fundamentals, but also, see if you agree with this, it's a slightly misunderstood thing about journalism. You know, when you tell people you're a journalist, or you, as a child, you announce that, you know, this is your ambition, people's initial reaction is always, oh, you must be very good at writing. You must be a great writer. And actually, once you get to doing it, you realize that actually writing is the very last stage in the process. And actually getting something substantial and meaningful and useful to write is actually the hard bit. And actually, it's much easier to learn how to write a pretty sentence than it is to get someone to tell you the stuff of their soul, to reveal to you the secret documents, you know, to go into the really sticky areas that you want them to go into. So do you agree with that? Do you agree that this is actually the much harder end of the story process? Talk amongst yourselves. Dani first.
Yeah, no, I do absolutely agree with that. The winning over people to trust you is the hardest. I mean, the thing about the writing part is once you've got it, it's all in your control, isn't it? You know, it's hard, but you've got it all there, and it's just up to you to marshal it. Whereas you can't control nearly as much how people are going to react to you, and even if you do persuade them, how you can marshal the way they talk to you, if they're distressed, their grief, and all of those kinds of things, it's much less in your control, and so it's a bit scarier as well, I would say, than the actual writing part.
Well, definitely, you're in the wild, aren't you, with it?
Yeah.
Anna, I would say that looking back, twisting people's arms to tell me stuff and to provide me with documents has been a far bigger part of my career than the narrative writing part. And now, you know, in the big picture, with audience trust and journalism declining around the world, I think that it's increasingly important to tell the stories about the story. So to explain to audiences, well, how did the New York Times break that story? Why did they pursue it? And to bring some transparency to the journalism process, to the audience understanding of journalism, so that, you know, there's a sense of, well, you know, this is who the reporter is, and increasingly we're seeing stories actually have an embedded video of the reporter saying, this is who I am, this is why interests, you know.
We lost you a little bit at the end there, but I think we got the essence of what you're saying. Well, would both of you just like to start to just talk about, you know, what are your kind of ground rules? How do you approach this? You know, when you're about to ring someone up or make contact with them for the first time, and you know you're going to have these difficult conversations, you're going to have to basically sell yourself, or, you know, persuade them that you're the person who can and will do a really good job of their story. So how do you go about that? So again, Dani first. What's your first move?
My first move is make sure I've done loads of research, because I think that the one thing that will convince people that you are the person to speak to is to know what you're talking about and not going cold and look like you know. So yeah. The way that you're committed to the story, you're actually actively invested in it. And then I suppose to find some, you know, to have thought about the sensitivities of it beforehand, so you're not, you know, because a lot of the people I personally speak to are quite vulnerable, and so thinking about the sensitivities and how they're going to react to certain things that you might say. And then also to try and at least give the illusion, if not to cede a little bit of control to them, or at least to give the illusion of ceding some control to them, so that they don't feel kind of bulldozed by it, and to give them a little bit of time to think about what you're saying. And then this whole thing about empathy, and I'd be interested to hear what Rowan thinks about this. I think there's a kind of a bit of a gender gap thing here, because I think for men, they can come across as like really authoritative, and people take them at that, you know, they will let them in because they look as if they're people that ought to be there and they ought to obey them. Whereas I think for women, you probably have to come across more as like a shoulder to cry on, or somebody that can strike up some kind of relationship. So therefore I try and be a little bit open about myself so that there isn't a power imbalance, so that it feels more like a conversation than an interview. That would be mine. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, Rowan, I'm just going to observe. It's interesting that you, Dani, you do a lot more stories about individuals, about their pain, their vulnerabilities, the ghastly personal experiences they've had. Whereas for you, Rowan, I think you have done things like that in your war, foreign reporting and so on, but you've also done a lot more kind of big issue, data-driven stories. But even within that, you still need to make the contact and, persuade the person who's the gatekeeper to the data. So how do you approach that?
Well, of course, the ideal thing is to build a relationship with a source over time, whether it's sending Christmas cards and coffees, but that's much easier for a beat reporter, someone who reports in health or in crime. I'm a general assignments foreign correspondent, and so I tend to be I parachute into a situation. I got to approach sources cold. Oftentimes they will decline to speak to me. What I then do is I'll write a pilot story on the same subject, and I'll send them the clip of that story and say, look, you can see that I'm legit, that that the story's accurate, that I know what I'm talking about. And often they'll then, having declined, they'll then agree to participate. That's quite a big one. I got a wonderful example, Anna, from you might remember the Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times story 2 years ago about that revealed the tax scams behind the Trump business empire.
Of course.
Now that story was remarkable because a private business, the books are closed. So the only way to gain access is to speak to current and past employees. And so Russ Butner at the New York Times was telling me, people would just slam the door in his face when he arrived on the doorstep. And he developed a psychological technique where he would arrive at the doorstep of these total strangers, ex-employees at the Trump empire, carrying a huge, thick, fat file of papers under his arm. The papers could be anything, junk mail, didn't matter. But what he found was that there was a psychological phenomenon in the minds of the employee opening the door, where they would see the file, and in their mind, they would subconsciously think, well, maybe this guy already knows the story. Got 99%. He doesn't need me to be the whistleblower who's going to be in the limelight. He just wants to confirm one or two facts. And that, those 10 seconds, crucial 10 seconds, you need that visual cue because, and that visual cue of that sense of this reporter knows what they're doing. They've done the research. They don't need me for everything. That was the key to the Trump story.
Mm. It's a slightly sneaky way of doing it, to kind of jump in and give the impression that you're slightly halfway through the story, already. Is that a technique that you've ever used, Dani? Have you got a folder of junk mail that you've ever taken to someone's door?
No, I don't think I have. I think, as Rowan says, it's a very different scenario, isn't it? Because I'm working in an area where I've built up sort of contacts over time. So I'd be more likely to, if I had a technique, it would be more likely to go and speak to somebody who knows somebody, so that they can say, so that they can vouch for me, or say, or to email previous stories I've done in that kind of field, to try and encourage them to say, well, I'm not going to sensationalize this because that's not really my style, or so those techniques more. I mean, one of the things I find that's a real bugbear at the moment is that increasingly there's a kind of third sector gatekeeping going on. So people more and more say to you, you go to a charity and where you would normally have got your case studies or whatever, and they'll say, oh, but these people are so vulnerable, they can't speak to you. And in fact, what they're doing is kind of stripping away the agency. They think that they're giving these people agency, but they're not. They're taking it away from them, and they're stopping their voices being heard. So increasingly, I'm using social media to go directly to, build up your own Twitter account, your social media following, so that you can go directly and say, does anybody know anybody who knows anybody who would be in this situation that could talk to me? And because you've built up your social media profile, the people are already predisposed. They know what the kind of work you do, so they're maybe a little bit more predisposed to come and speak to you anyway. That trust is built up very gradually like that.
Yeah, I mean, your reputation and your cuttings do do a lot of that heavy lifting for you, don't they, once you are established. I loved it. I hadn't really thought of it the way that you just framed it there, Rowan, that, you know, you send them a kind of calling card piece. You know, you arrive somewhere, you send a calling card piece, and you're basically saying, you know, yeah, here it is, here's the basics, I'm a decent, you know, straight up guy, you know, help me do something better, you know, help me find more and go wider, go deeper, whatever it is. I'm going to be making a serious note of that one.
I was going to follow up, Anna, just on what Dani said, that when you think about, you know, why is someone reluctant to speak to you, you can break it down into, you know, their fear of repercussions, of kind of reprisal, even of surveillance. And so you can answer those methodically, and you can say, well, I'm going to suggest to this source that they use Signal, an encrypted communication system, to speak with me. So there's no way that they can be found out. I'm going to encourage them to open a Proton Mail email account, which is an encrypted way of sending me documents. And if necessary, if we need to meet in person and they're very concerned about being spied on, as you know, happened with Rowan and Farrow in the Weinstein case a couple of years ago, they can meet inside a federal courthouse where no one can bring in electronic surveillance equipment or, you know, on the air side of an airport. But you know, the ethical point is interesting, where, you know, sometimes if there's an overwhelming public interest, that you know, there's a great urgency that the information has to get out there, that as long as you explain to readers how you did it. I'm thinking of a case where there was a woman on death row who we were convinced did not have the mental capacity to stand trial in Botswana. She wanted to speak, but the prison authorities didn't want journalists to speak to her. And so I arrived at the court, at the prison, wearing a black gown and you know, and carrying an old beat up leather briefcase. And I didn't I didn't declare myself as her attorney, they just assumed it.
Yeah.
So I was able to get that key interview, and that was important.
Interesting what you're saying though about people's you know, points of resistance, because a big one that I personally have found is people that have been burned by other journalists. You know, if it's a long running story and they've had a horrendous experience with someone, either, you know, that the way that the person treated them face to face, or more probably the story that somebody wrote. And it can be the most tiny detail or random thing that they have really taken against that has then, you know, shut it down and made it much, much more difficult for other people to pick that story up. I wonder if either of you had found that, and if you had some brilliant techniques that I can steal to get around that one as well. Dani?
Well, yes, I think it's like Rowan mentioned earlier, it's increasingly difficult because the trust in journalism has gone. So you're actually starting on a back foot right away, almost all the time, aren't you? I think what he said about understanding what the reservations are so that you can address them is really important. So that, you know, if they have been burned before, what was it that other journalist did? How can they be protected against it? What are you going to offer them that'll show them that you will be different, but even just listening to those, even just taking the time to listen to those fears and kind of address them is probably the main thing. And then again, it's that back to, well, this is how I've handled other stories, and I'm used to doing this kind of, I'm used to handling things sensitively, and just gradually building that relationship with them. I think it's very much a question of time, isn't it? If you have to rush in and rush out, then that's difficult. But if you can spend a bit of time to and fro with people, then you do gradually win over their trust, I think.
It's also just a very difficult thing though to ask someone to do, like, you know, to say, you know, my colleague who looks very like me, who's got the same job as me, you know, did this horrible thing to you, or even this thing that actually wasn't really horrible, but just for whatever reason that you didn't like. But I want you to trust me not to do that. I mean, that is a cigarette paper to walk on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rowan.
And certainly, you know, but I'll say this: brand credibility sure does help. You know, if you're backed by a trusted.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I was thinking of when the Kursk submarine sank in 2000. This Russian submarine, all of these Russian sailors were stranded and trapped at the bottom of the ocean, but still alive. My editor at the Washington Post asked me to find someone to explain what that must be like. And so I thought I was, I thought I was a real genius. And I thought, well, how about the astronauts on Apollo 13, where they were trapped in space with no real, chance of rescue in space, going around the moon with a disabled spacecraft. And they're in a metal tube as well. So I called Commander Jim Lovell, who, later played by Tom Hanks in the movie. And I thought I was really smart. And his secretary said, yeah, you're the 8th reporter. But he said, she said, Commander Lovell is not speaking on this issue. And I said, okay, well, just, if he changes his mind, I'm Rowan from the Washington Post. And she said, oh, hang on, I'll put you right through. And just having that brand behind me, that earned the trust on my behalf. So that was awesome.
No, that's very true. I mean, Dani and I used to both work together at the Sunday Times. And it really does open a lot of doors, doesn't it, when you phone up and say, hello, it's the Sunday Times here. I find that noticeably grieved things that would previously have been sticky. Did you not find that, Dani?
Yes, although I think being freelance, the sort of flip side of that is being freelance. You can say, well, I'm not beholden to any, so I can't be told to do what to take an editorial. That freedom, it means you can say, I'm doing this exactly the way I want it. They're not going to be told by an editor, and that can be quite reassuring as well, I think. Yeah. I think I'm maybe just in my head,
comparing it to working in local papers, where you turn up at someone's door and someone will shout, "More, there's a wee lassie for a paper at the door," and then phoning up wherever and saying, "Hello, I'm from the Sunday Times," and somehow everyone's really pleased to hear from you. Have you noticed that, and I mean, I'm talking quite in decades maybe here, things getting more difficult, and that trust and people's approach and attitude to journalists has changed, over the length of your career, looking back decades?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I definitely have. And I think that, because we were going to talk about Salmond a little bit, to look at that, it's not only that people don't trust you, it's also that they're peddling complete disinformation that you're then having to counter. I mean, I find that is a very new thing, maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, that you're constantly, you're producing something that is factual, that you have researched, and people are categorically just disputing it. And there's really it's very, very hard. Once a false narrative's been entrenched, it's really, really difficult to roll back from. Sorry?
Give us an example of that.
After the trial finished, and it was an acquittal, as you know, on all charges, this whole narrative around the women being liars started up, and that became very, very pernicious very quickly. And so you're trying to explain that actually it was a bit more nuanced than that. The jury have to find beyond reasonable doubt, and also that there were some things that were admitted as inappropriate behaviours. So some harassment might have taken place, but there was no criminality. But there was a whole army of people peddling that one narrative, and trying to take that on is like, it's exhausting. And it's not only in your print; it then spills over into social media. So you find yourself spending hours on Twitter trying to counter stuff that that you've got absolutely no hope of countering. Really.
Well, I was going to ask. I mean, is that really? It seems to me really that social media is where that has started, and not, well, maybe not started, but where it has definitely speeded up and become so much easier. Whereas previously it might have been, someone giving you a hard time, on question time, or taking the trouble to write a letter to the paper. Now that has just become, accessible to everybody with a smartphone.
Yeah, absolutely, and because you're not engaging with them actually in real life, it becomes much more bile-laden. You know, people feel free to say things that they would never say if they were actually having a conversation with you. But and they're able to peddle things that are just completely untrue about you as well. So you've got all that. So you've got a distrust in the profession, and then you've got the actual way that manifests itself as a personal backlash against you, kind of thing.
Rowan, what's your experience been over the kind of decades?
Well, I'll say recently. Well, my thought was on, recently there's been a debate in the investigative journalism community about what the role of reporters should be with regards to disinformation. And increasingly, I think reporters are stepping back and allowing this wonderful new, rapidly growing class of fact-checking organizations around the world to do the debunking. So they do so First Draft is a great example. The Associated Press, one of GIGN's partners in India, data leads, have recruited a whole network of doctors to fact check claims about the coronavirus and vaccines in real time. So there's literally more than 100 organizations now actively fact checking dubious claims on social media, and that leaves room for investigative and data journalists to look at, well, who's behind it, so who did it and why. Sometimes there's certain kinds of stories we don't know how to do yet. For instance, who's behind robocalls? For some reason, that's the most difficult story anyone can do. There's a robocall going out saying, don't bother to come to the election, to vote on Tuesday, come on Wednesday. And so who's behind those robocalls? No one knows how to find that out at the moment, to my surprise. So there's certain areas of investigative journalism that are really tough nuts to crack. Shell companies, royal families and monarchies, and robocalls are the three that come to mind for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it's tackling these big kind of almost conceptual issues, do you still get the same level of grief and pain that the likes of Dani writing about an emotive court case will get? Do you get people just saying, well, no, actually, that's not the case, and really blatantly putting an opposite case that is, proven to be dysfactual, or is the heat taken out of those kind of stories a bit?
I'm not sure. I can certainly speak to the, as a male reporter, I know that I'm subject to much less abuse and doxing that my female counterparts endure on a weekly basis in this industry. And the Dart Center for Journalism is one of many organizations that's there to help those reporters and to try and deflect some of this and protect themselves from this kind of abuse. There's tools like Google Voice, which is amazing. It becomes like sources can't track back and harass reporters. If they use Google Voice as a single telephone number for all of their phones in their digital life, it's harder for them to do that. There's certain solutions that can protect reporters from the abusive response to stories. In terms of the official response, I mean, it tends to be the smallest, the least likely party that's the biggest problem. Something in the caption, something in the blurb will stand first. It's never the main point in the story that gets you into real conflict with the principles.
Can I just say to everybody watching this that the Q&A box is open. It would be great to see some questions from you guys. We will be hopefully going over to doing questions in about 10 minutes. And so far I don't have any. So please don't be shy. Please feel free to put questions either to Dani, to Rowan, to both, whatever. And we'll be getting around to that. So yeah, go for it. So Dani, you touched on the Salmond trial. So talk to me. I mean, there was huge issues of trust there. So for the non-Scots in the house, Could you just very quickly nutshell, you know, what were the key kind of trust issues that you faced in dealing with that, which has been such a huge and important and seismic, really, story here in Scotland?
But I think I went into it not really understanding just what I was, you know, just what the backlash and how emotive it would be. So, I mean, from a storytelling point of view, the reason I wanted to get involved in it is because right back at the beginning of Me Too, when all of that was breaking, I was reading a lot of Rebecca Solnit, and she talks about, you know, controlling the narrative, who gets to tell the story and how. So when the Samad allegations broke, I immediately thought, how am I going to feel sitting on the sidelines watching, you know, because you know, Scotland's very male dominated in terms of political reporters, and I thought, am I going to, you know, am I going to sit and watch all of that happen, and then framing it in the way that they would frame it, which would be more like, you know, scalp claiming and all of that. So I sort of thought, well, I'm definitely wanting to tell this story from a Me Too perspective and try and keep my eyes on the complainers and and how the justice system works for women. So I kind of committed to going to every day of the trial without having a commission, and then I got a commission and wrote it. And I think that people thought that it was going to be a court report. I think people looked at that and were expecting a court report, where what I was trying to do was try and portray the justice system, portray how the defence had operated. Because, for example, the advocate said he wanted to put a smell on the women. That was his tactic. So I was writing about that, and I was writing about just the way people, you know, that was used to undermine the women, basically. And so at the end of that, there were people who felt that who wanted to see it as a straight, they wanted me to have done a straight, you know, here is the prosecution, here is the defence, here is the, and there was, so I think there was a lot of, not so much lack of trust, but just a lack of understanding of how journalism functions. It's not all about, you know, just, there are straight reports and then there are analysis pieces. And I think that after that, it all became very, very highly politicised, and that's where other trust broke down, because once the inquiry started up, everybody was trying to wage, instead of trying to get to the truth, all the political parties were trying to, you know, make their own political points and wage their own agendas, and then that became really difficult to chart a path through and actually work out what was true and what wasn't true when there was all that noise going on around you, you know, all the noise of people. Well, some disinformation and just people taking things, you know, a lot of propaganda around it and trying to chart a path. I think that was probably the most difficult thing. And of course, there were legal restrictions as well. So you couldn't actually say everything that you wanted to say, and then you couldn't explain everything because of the anonymity of the complainers, all of whom worked in and around government. So that became very complicated as well.
And you actually spoke to some of the women involved, correct?
Yeah.
So how did you
I wanted to do that, you know, that was my prime goal at the beginning. Yeah.
And did you have any of these trust issues that we were talking with them? You know, did you have to build a relationship with them, or were they quite clear that this was something that they wanted to do?
Well, in fact, because they were witnesses, I couldn't really approach them until after the trial. And of course, so what I did instead was I just made it really, really well known what I was doing and what I was trying to do in the circles that I knew that they would hear about it, basically, and left my number lots and lots of places until, so after the trial, the ones I spoke to 5 of the 9, and they all contacted me rather than me contacting them. So so in that sense, there wasn't those trust issues because they'd taken the decision that they wanted to do that. I think it was far more for me when I was speaking to them a question of expectation management, because you're promising to give them a voice, but obviously I couldn't use everything that they told me because of all the legal restrictions. So, but I mean, luckily they were all professional, really intelligent, articulate people. So, you know, they weren't as, they understood that not everything that they said would be able to be used in the way that they wanted it to be presented.
That raises a really interesting question that I'll try and remember while I say, we have questions. Thank you, everybody, and we'll be getting to them very soon. But that just raises the point that maybe you can both address, is that the difficulty of dealing with people who maybe aren't so articulate, who aren't so clearly able to frame what they want to say, describe their experiences. Now, you know that their experiences are really valid and something that you want to very much include and cover. How do you help them to frame talking about their experiences without putting words into their mouths? Rowan.
Boy, look, the first thought that came to mind, it might not be right on. I was thinking about covering the floods in Mozambique, where we had a real translation problem because there was, there was one translator translating from Shona into Portuguese and another from Portuguese into English. And I was talking to these kids who had been kind of refugees and been living under a tarp for a year after the floods had killed their parents. I was getting, a long answer from the kid, and then I was getting kind of no from the Portuguese translator.
Oh, yeah.
So, it was tough. But what I did was, while the photographer was taking their pictures, I used that time to really scour the room, the tent, and I found these amazing drawings that these kids had done. Showing the helicopters hovering above the floodwaters, tragically showing the bodies of grown-ups sort of floating underneath the floodwaters, eventually became part of a larger project that I think UNICEF collaborated on, actually collecting all these images that these children had drawn. And I was looking at all the pictures, and I thought there's something missing from these pictures that you normally see on the door of a fridge, And I'm like, it was the image of the kids that excluded themselves in so many of these images after that. Now, I don't know what that means from a psychological perspective, but it suggested tremendous trauma. And so anyway, I'm sorry, it's a little bit off topic, but that, I think it's an important interview technique to use that time while the photographer is doing their thing to really scour the room. One of my favorite examples was speaking to Nelson Mandela's curator at Mandela's office. And while the pictures were going on, I snuck around the back of the desk, and I was expecting to find framed photographs of Mandela's family and of the South African flag. And there was only one picture there, and it was of Muhammad Ali. And I thought, wow. So that became like an important narrative point for my story.
But that you touch on something that I thought we might get round to, which is talking about working with translators and so on. But Dani, how just to get back to my original question, when you're dealing with people who maybe aren't particularly articulate, but have had an experience that you want to get into your story, how do you deal with that? This is partly me being selfish, because that's one of the things that I think is actually extremely difficult to do without putting words into people's mouths, without, filtering it through your own vocabulary. How do you tackle that?
It is that is really difficult. Although I have to say that some of the people that you might assume are not articulate, you suddenly find that they're absolutely articulate and that they've just got a different way of speaking. And then, in fact, the way that they speak is interesting in itself. Their speech patterns and all of those things are really interesting in itself. I mean, at the moment, I'm involved in a radio program that's involved in interviewing a lot of drug addicts. So, first of all, you have to find them at a time when there's a real balance there, because you need to have informed consent, and you need to have them at a time when they can, but when they're not taking, they can be also really, so if you get them before they've hit up, then they're kind of a bit aggressive and antsy, but then obviously afterwards they're zombified. So I think just taking it really slowly, don't you think, Hannah? Don't you think just giving them the space to not feel too pressurized and talk slowly, and then maybe there'll be a lot that you can't use, but then suddenly there'll be something that they say that's just an absolute jewel, and you just go, oh my god, that's it, that's the thing I'm going to use. Yes, and you just know as you're driving back to the office that was the bit that's going to be your intro or whatever. You know?
Yeah, you sometimes have to stop yourself actually doing that while they're speaking, because that would kill the moment.
That's so true.
Yeah. Guys, we've got some actually great questions, and now is this a good moment to pivot to questions? I'll take your silence as a yes. So a really good question here from Bradley. What is your question process? You know, how do you get to the difficult questions? What sort of exploratory questions do you ask? I think this is really important because, you know, the timing of an interview is so crucial, you know, to get it right, so you leave enough time to talk about the sticky stuff if they want to talk about it, but you don't ask it too soon and piss them off in case they don't want to talk about it at all. So how do you pace your interview? Okay, Rowan first.
Okay, sure. Well, I've always found that the last 5 minutes of an interview are the most important. So not just to ask that classic, you know, what have I forgotten to ask question, which I do recommend. But also to think about the little asides that the person has made earlier in the interview and to follow up on that. And it's uncanny how the strongest stories have emerged from, you know, we've hit the end of the agreed time, and those additional 5 minutes before you're out the door really end up in the lead sentence. That's extraordinary. It might be because by that time you've built up some kind of trust and rapport that they're willing to be a little more candid. I'm not sure. Of course, you know, as the questioner knows, you know, open-ended questions are critical in almost any interview scenario. You don't want to box them in with binary yes/no questions. And you know, if you're doing a right of reply type interview with you know, the target of the investigation or someone who's alleged to have been involved with wrongdoing, yeah, you want to save those questions right for the end, so that you can at least grant them some balance if they storm out the interview with some content, and then make clear to them.
Dani.
Yeah, I'll come to the difficult question bit, but one thing that I found really, really difficult to learn because I'm a complete gab is to leave. Is not to fill in the gap. This spaces. I find that so difficult, that it's the most effective thing, isn't it? Because if nobody likes dead space and nobody likes silence. So if you're prepared to kind of not blink and leave the silence, they will fill it instead of you. But such a hard thing. I find it really hard to do. And yes, in terms of the difficult questions, I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, at least halfway through, get people off onto something that they want to talk about, let them take complete control at the beginning, because they'll have things they want to get off their chest. They've got some motivation for talking to you, so let them say those things that they desperately want to say, and then kind of build up to the more difficult things, and kind of maybe just don't preface them too much, just kind of slip them in there.
And I thought of a nice example, if that's helpful, for the value of those last 5 minutes. We're on interview with Bill Gates. Now, every year the Bill Gates Foundation has this famously boring kind of like annual letter interview with reporters, and you know, Bill Gates sits with a group of reporters, and you know, it's wonderful work they do, but you know, the reporting phase can be tedious. But I noticed during the interview that he said, you know, he was talking about funding research into development of drugs for HIV and AIDS and for malaria, and then he threw in and then also for polio. But he said something about like remarkably the same amount for polio. And I went back to that at the end of the interview, and I said, well, what was so strange about how much you spent on polio research? And it turns out this issue was tearing him up. That, you know, he knows that for $1 billion, you know, thousands of lives can be saved, people living with HIV. Thousands can be saved with, tens of thousands with malaria. But there were only 235 polio cases in the whole world. And he was spending the same amount of money on polio as he was on these huge diseases. And so he knew that, you know, he could have saved thousands more people, you know, living with AIDS had he not allocated those funds to this almost extinct disease. But he felt that he just had to do it. Otherwise, it would come back. You know, you have to smash polio with a sledgehammer. You can't mess around with it. And it reminded me of the end of the Schindler's List movie, you know, where, you know, Oskar Schindler is, you know, why didn't I sell my ring? I could have saved 6 or 7 more, you know, people in the concentration camps. And it was really powerful.
But I think that's a really good teaching point, is that I think a mistake a lot of beginners make is having a list of questions and just going through them and not listening to what people say. I mean, it's the most basic thing, but not listening to what people say, thinking, you know, thinking on your feet, which is exactly what you did in that case, you know. And if you'd just been going on to your next question, then, you know, you'd have missed that. I can't miss this opportunity to tell you one of my favorite ever stories when I worked with a fantastic journalist called Graham Virtue, and he was preparing to interview Status Quo, and I saw him sitting bent over his notebook. Well, what are you doing, Graham? He said, oh, I'm working on my question list. And then he looked up, he'd clearly been thinking about this, and he looked up and he said, you know, but I think I might just ask them the same 3 questions over and over and over again. And that was just, that's what I love working in newspapers. You know, that's the quality of chat you get. So another question from someone anonymous. At the beginning of your careers, were you nervous or anxious about approaching potential interviewees, and how did you overcome that? So Dani, nervous, anxious?
Oh my God, because I trained the very traditional way, which is to come through like an evening newspaper, and so you got sent out to I mean, this is just an awful term, but death knocks, you know. I mean, we had to do death knock after death knock. And I mean, I can't even actually believe we did this. Now it horrifies me, but you would be given a death notice out of the newspaper, and it would say tragically, and you'd know absolutely nothing about the circumstances around the death, and you'd have to go to the house and work and make your way in. And I would feel physically sick. I mean, and then I would sit outside the house for ages before I did it, and then I'd pray the people weren't in, and then but you just, I suppose, gradually, first of all, you get inured to the people slamming doors in your face. You just think, well, that's part of the job, and if that happens, you know, sometimes that's just the way it is. And then other times you would find that people genuinely did want to talk to you, and in fact they were grateful for the opportunity to talk about their loved one, or maybe something had happened that they wanted to complain. You know, there'd been some breakdown in health services or whatever that they wanted to talk about. And so gradually, just over time, you learn to kind of take it on the chin when you don't get it, but also just not to be as worried about it, and to understand that some people will always want to talk to you, and that's, you know, and that's fine.
Rowan, how about you? You've dealt with some scary dudes.
Yeah, but yeah, honestly, I've tended to find, you know, high school principals more scary than warlords. Going way back to my high school days, I suppose.
Yes, the teacher.
Yeah, you know, it's the kind of story I was always terrified of not getting the story, and especially because as a foreign correspondent, my newspaper would spend money to give me a plane ticket to go somewhere, and you knew if you didn't deliver that story, you were never going to be asked to go on a foreign story again. So you had to get it. And so I always wanted to go on the natural disaster stories, because they're the easiest human interest stories you can imagine. I mean, every single person you see, including the taxi driver, is relevant. You know, they're either a victim or a looter or an emergency worker, or someone who knows someone who's been affected. So natural disaster stories were sorry, but they were wonderful from a reporter's point of view. And especially because I found the key to doing them, which was to always take sunblock, mosquito repellent, and water purification tablets, those 3 things, not to use them, but to barter with the well-resourced reporters from AFP and the BBC, because they would always forget. And so I could say, look, guys, you know, I don't have a satellite phone. I don't have Kevlar. I'll give you the sunblock because you're, and then give me 2 minutes on the sat phone. So I was able to barter my way through several countries using things like that, just a little pharmaceutical bag. And then conversely, you'd have the nightmare stories where you had to get one interview or, you know, there was no story. I remember a South African judge being arrested for sexual assault in India while he was leading an anti-sexual assault commission there. And I had to get an interview with the judge on trial, or the whole trip was pointless. And so that's a really terrifying prospect. And I couldn't get an interview. So eventually I just physically dove into the prison truck on the way back, and I just refused to get out. And they just let me stay.
It's funny how the combination of the deadline and the huge cost of, of getting you there concentrates the mind wonderfully, doesn't it? And you're like, well, whatever, needs must. A couple here of questions that maybe sit together. Dani, Jen asking you about defending your stories on social media, and getting embroiled and trying to, have a debate, or not even, it's not even a debate, is it? Just trying to put people right. She's asking, do you feel that this perhaps shouldn't be up to journalists to do this? Or do you feel compelled to defend your work because the Twitter machine just goes so nuts? And then another question we can maybe take together, what do we think we can do about the increasing abuse of journalists online, especially of women? So Dani, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, do I feel compelled? Well, when I first started, so I've probably been on social media since about 2012. When I first started, I was absolutely determined that I was going to engage, because I just think that you have the journalists are accountable, and you should have to account for your stories. And also, I think that for many people, engaging with journalists actually, that's a way of explaining to them how it works and how you've got the story that you've got. But over time, it's just become...
It lasts about 6 weeks.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes it does work. Sometimes people will then befriend you then, and you become quite, you become constant, a conversation goes back and forth. But no, it's too much really to expect. It's an emotional burden eventually, and also you can't really win. That's There are people with whom you will never win. You could spend half an hour explaining step by step how you did something and why what they're saying isn't true, and you would get absolutely nowhere, and they would just be insulting you. So I think
it's not what they want from it, is it?
No, I don't. I think that's exactly it. They don't actually want to understand it. They just want to have a go, and you are a journalist, and therefore you're bad, and therefore they're gonna. So I block a lot now, and which I really hate. I hate myself for doing it, but I do block and I mute, and just because your mental health at the end of it has to count for something. As for what you can do, I absolutely don't know. I mean, maybe there's something to be said for like it being part of the conversation at schools. I think we do need to find some way of explaining how journalism works, and that it's not all, that we're not all agenda driven, and that we're not all trying to, whether it's the SNP or whoever, that we're not all out to get people all the time, and that conversation has to be had somewhere. And maybe we've not been very good. Maybe we've not felt that we needed to explain or educate people before, and maybe that's a good thing in a way that so the internet's been democratizing as well as being difficult, hasn't it? And maybe that's a good thing, and maybe we should be having those conversations with people to try and but not on Twitter, somewhere else where you're educating people from a younger age as to how it all functions.
Rowan, do you find yourself in the position of having to, explain yourself and defend your stories online?
Well, what I've seen is that, there's various ways of bulletproofing your stories from those kinds of attacks. And one of them that's really a wonderful phenomenon, I think, is this phenomenon of collaboration, where you have multiple platforms, sometimes text, video, radio in France, whatever, and they all run the same story simultaneously, or, different versions, but with the same collected facts. And there's an agreed upon deadline, which is
like Cambridge Analytica.
Right, and it's always complicated when you have a video partner because the editing process takes so long. But we saw, at GIGN, we've done several stories that show the tremendous benefits of collaborating. They're no longer the enemy or the competition. We're all on the same side now, the side of truth. And the story that was done, that we explained on GIGN about how the murder of 2 United Nations aid workers in the Congo, and it turns out that the government was complicit in their murders. The fact that the Congolese government couldn't really dismiss the story because the local reporters say, hey, look, the same facts are published in Sweden and in Foreign Affairs magazine and on radio in France. And not just that, but they didn't have to actually publish at all. So they were spared the potential attack from the government by simply surrendering their byline and handing over the information to their colleagues elsewhere. But at least the story was out there and the impact was clear. So I think the collaboration is a really powerful growing force.
I can see that working in such a big international story. I don't see that being so successful in the more parochial stories, which are what rips people's knitting, aren't they? They're quite small, quite localized issues where, in a pressure cooker country like Scotland, everyone's falling out about it. What do you think, Dani?
One of the things I think is that journalists, I'm sure Rowan's right that on a global level that kind of collaboration is possible, but like a long time ago, I was involved in a court case that's too complicated to explain at the moment. But the one thing that kept me going through all of that was that all journalists believed I was right. So therefore, you had the whole solidarity of journalists behind you. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that one of the things I've discovered is that back to the salmon thing again, is that journalists have polarized as well. So so half the time you're not even being supported by your own profession. So I'm not sure if I think that collaboration is, I can see it working when you've got massive organizations behind you, but not as a freelance working off your own bat very much.
Now that's interesting. So we've got a question actually that leads quite well on from that, from Elizabeth Garner. So she says, going back to media brands and trust, do newer outlets have the same level of trust as established brands? I'm thinking of Al Jazeera, RT, etc. Has the landscape become partisan? So thoughts about that? Dani?
I don't really know the answer to that. Has the landscape become partisan? So you mean, do I work for organisations where I know what the take will be before is that the question, or?
I don't know what the question is. I think the question is maybe, are the heritage brands, possibly print brands, seen differently as newer brands such as, RT is a pretty clear example. I don't think anyone thinks RT is anything other than a partisan brand, whereas Al Jazeera does seem to have a very good reputation of doing serious, international, thorough, grown-up journalism. My feeling about that is that it's each, there are new brands who are clearly partisan and have an agenda that pokes you in the eye, and there are some that are very, that are very, what I would consider good, balanced, serious news.
Wasn't that always the way though? Wasn't that always the way? That there would be different brands would have a different degree of credibility with people. I think.
So maybe it hasn't changed particularly. It's just maybe the format's changed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I do think the landscape, especially investigative reporting, is moving towards non-profit startups, and these small newsrooms have tremendous credibility with their members, and then the newsletter kind of drive, and organizations like OCCRP and YORStory in the Republic of Georgia. Bellingcat is a remarkable organization that does forensic journalism. That's growing a whole new brand of journalism. It's really at the tip of the spear. I heard at our GIGN conference in Hamburg last year, a senior person suggesting that all investigative journalism will be nonprofit in future. Mm-hmm. It's very encouraging. There's a group called Amabungane in South Africa, which is doing phenomenal work, and it took, their stories, they had sufficient trust and credibility that the corrupt president of the country, Jacob Zuma, was ultimately ousted from power. So they actually had that kind of power, the power that the Washington Post had as a huge institution in the 70s. And now Amabungane, this very small group in South Africa, has sparked 7 or 8 nonprofits in Lesotho and Botswana, Incan Botswana, Namibia, and elsewhere. And they're finding a way to be a focal point for funding for founders, the Open Society and elsewhere. So they don't have to fly to these different countries. That's too expensive for funders, but they can go to one place and hear the pitches from all these small newsrooms around Southern Africa. And it's really making a difference. These guys are having impact because people believe them.
And that's the funding as well, that isn't it? And the especially in papers, apart from a very few elite titles, the heritage media just aren't prepared to fund the kinds of investigative journalism, the kind of long form, broad investigative work that just costs a lot of money and uses a lot of people and resources and so on. And it's fantastic that the digital world has allowed that to kind of re-exist in a different format and using a different funding model and everything. I mean, I think that is one of the few really positive things for the media that has come out of the digital revolution. Did you have something to say, Dani?
Well, I was just going to say, listening to Rowan and thinking about Scotland, that is right, isn't it? Exactly what you said. There's the resources aren't there for papers anymore. You can't do and there's a whole emphasis on the clickbait stuff and listicles and all of that. And then you see something like The Ferret, which has, which is our equivalent of, which is doing amazing work and not thinking about clicks, because a lot of what it does is not naturally clickable, and it's doing a lot of really good investigative work. So I do agree with that. And
it backs up something that I always say when 25-year-olds at parties, usually men, give me a lecture about how the internet has ruined newspapers or changed the media, and then after they've talked about this for about 20 minutes, they get round to asking me what I think about it, and what I say is that but people still want the same things. They just want it in a different format. And I think the success of organisations like the Fair absolutely prove that. People do still absolutely want to know about these things and hold these organisations to account and dive deep into all kinds of subjects. I just don't particularly want to read it, on a great big sheet of paper that gets their hands grubby and that they have to get out of bed on Sunday morning to go and buy it. Guys, I'm going to have one last very quick question, and actually that you've maybe slightly addressed before, but I think it's an interesting question. So we'll just maybe do it quickly because I don't like to overrun on these things. So anonymous attendee, who, thank you very much, Anonymous, for your questions, asks, do you see your role as therapeutic, helping people get things off their chests? And have you found that people are actually relieved to speak to you? So what do you think? Rowan, have you found people actually pleased to share the details of their arms deals with you?
Boy, listen, I've frequently been astonished that folks have told me the things that they do. I'm like, really? But I try to put myself in their shoes, and I haven't been very successful in trying to imagine what I would do if I saw Rowan coming up the front lawn with a file.
With your junk mail.
You know, it has been that way. I mean, I once, you know, I once received I interviewed the fire chief of Johannesburg, who unleashed this racist tirade about firemen of color in his brigade. And I published the story, and he was fired because he clearly was a racist. And he came to attack me for publishing the story. And I said, hey man, that's really what you believe though, isn't it? And he said, it really is. You know? So he got it off his chest. He's a bigot and he can't have that job.
Dani?
Yes, I think that once people start to talk, they might be reticent about starting, but once they start to talk, I think most people want to say their piece in the way that they want to say it, and it's actually a relief to them to have somebody to say it to very often.
Mm-hmm. 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 Brilliant. We've managed to end on an up note. I'm absolutely thrilled about that. Listen, guys, can I thank you both for such an interesting, stimulating session. It slightly reminds me of, you know, working at newspapers and going to the pub once you finish work and, you know, talking about what went wrong on page 7 until, you know, 2 in the morning. It's been hugely enjoyable. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And can I thank you as well, Anna, as Dani and Rowan, on behalf of YORStories for, well, all 3 of you agreeing to give us this terrific event. It's absolutely fascinating. And we've had great questions, which just shows how much people have enjoyed and have engaged with the event. And can I let everybody who's watching know that this was the second really of our journalism events today. We had some football journalists earlier, and then we've had these investigative and long form writers. And at 6:30 GMT or UTC, we have what we've called the Correspondence Cafe. We have international correspondents who are from one country and work in another and explain it back to the first one, or the other way around. We have Anna Bosch from Spain, Rob Cameron, the BBC's man in Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Frederica Geerdink, which I'm sure I have pronounced really, really badly, who's a young Dutch journalist who's done amazing work from Kurdistan. And they'll be talking with the well-known Portuguese journalist Fernanda Freitas, and that's at, say, 6:30 GMT. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dani. Thank you, Anna.
My pleasure.